As simple as it.
Sam, can you describe, staying with personality disorders, can you describe your view of the self? And because the story that we often hear is that the narcissist and the borderline personality disorder has a weak sense of self, and that because of the weak sense of self for the narcissist, they're constantly seeking an affirmation of themselves to feel present. Do you agree with that view? And I think the borderline story is that the person with the borderline personality disorder also has a weak sense of self, and that they tend to over-identify at first with somebody. They love somebody, they fall in love very easily, and then they fall out of love very easily. Again, the Hollywood starlet sort of picture or archetype seems to come in there. Is that your view of the self? Talk us through that issue.
Yeah, so um, you've raised several issues which are only tangentially related, but that's a common kind of thing to do if you're not really deeply into the literature. So the first thing is idealization devaluation cycles. That is common in both borderline and in narcissism. In both these disorders, initially the intimate partner or the friend or the colleague or whoever is idealized in the sense that the affected individual, the narcissist or the borderline, the afflicted individual, I'm sorry, develops a representation of the other person in their mind, which is then photoshopped. I call it snapshotting. Creates a snapshot, and then snapshot is photoshopped and becomes ideal, perfect entity. And then, owing to some inexorable dynamics in both these conditions, it's not the same dynamics, different dynamics in both these conditions, this internal object is then devalued and becomes persecutory. And so there are these cycles of idealization, devaluation in both cases. In the case, to give you in a nutshell, in the case of the borderline, the reason is what we call separation insecurity, or colloquially abandonment anxiety. It's when the borderline experiences or anticipates rejection, abandonment, and so on. And what she does, she devalues for example, the intimate partner in preparation for the inevitable separation. So then, like, it's a resolution of cognitive dissonance. If he is devalued, it's not such a big loss, So to mitigate the horrible reaction to abandonment, she simply changes her perception of the object that is about to abandon her.
Mm.
That's a borderline. In narcissism, the idealization and evaluation have to do with a much deeper psychodynamic. It's a reenactment of early childhood conflicts with a usually maternal figure, with the mother. So what the narcissist does, he converts, for example, his intimate partners, but not only his friends and so on. He converts them into maternal figures and then idealizes them the way a baby idealizes mother. And then, in order to experience separation from the mother and individuation, becoming an individual, something that he has failed to do as a child, he now wants to accomplish with his new surrogate substitute mother. And so then he has to devalue her. That's the only way to separate from her. Because so initially he idealizes her as a mother, and then in order to separate from her still as a mother, he needs to devalue her, and then there are grounds for separation. She's devalued, she's the enemy, she's stupid, she's ugly, she can do no right, and so on. And this gives rise to the inevitable separation. And it's a reenactment, what Freud called repetition compulsion. So the dynamics are different, but the idealization devaluation cycle is the same and looks the same from the outside, which is very confusing to many people. So this
Mm.
was the second part of your question. Can you remind me what was the first part? I lost myself.
The sense of self.
Oh, sense of self, right. Sorry. Um, Again, there's a difference in etiology. Etiology means the causation of the disorders. Whereas in narcissistic personality disorder, there is a disruption in the formation of the self, early childhood disruption. The child fails to develop a self and then to integrate it and constellate it. These are processes that are described in the literature as to how the self is created. So, to summarize it, the child fails to create a self. And then, because there is no self there, the child creates a substitute known in the literature as the false self.
Hmm.
It has all the hallmarks of the self, of a self. It has all the hallmarks of a self. And at the same time, it's godlike. It's impeccable. It's perfect. It's omniscient. It's omnipotent. It has all the qualities of a
Hmm.
god. So in this sense, narcissism is a primitive religion. You have a deity or a divinity, which is the false self, which substitute for the non-existent self in the child. And what the child does, engages in human sacrifice. The child sacrifices itself to this Moloch, to this divinity. In other words, eliminates the true self. And all that remains is the false self
Hmm.
for the rest of the narcissist's life.
Hmm.
So inside the narcissist, there is an absence masquerading as a presence.
Hmm.
There is nobody there. We call it in clinical literature the empty schizoid core. It's an emptiness. It's a void, howling void. Was compared later by Thurston and others to a black hole. Identical situation exists in the borderline. Actually, in borderline personality disorder, internal emptiness is a diagnostic criterion, one of the
Hmm.
diagnostic criteria. Now, this emptiness in the borderline is completely different to the narcissist. Whereas in the narcissist, the absence, this howling void, is the outcome, is where the self should have been, and is not. In the borderline, the progression of the disease is very different. There is actually no major disruption or interruption in the formation of a self, but there is a major disruption in the formation of an identity. Now, identity and self are not the same thing. Self is your sense of continuity. Self is just another name for this sense of continuity and contiguity. Waking up in the morning and saying, I'm still Michael Shellenberger. I'm still me. Never mind what has happened. I've become 40 years older. I've divorced. I've had an accident. I lost 4 of my limbs. I'm still Michael. So this is the self. Whereas identity is something completely different. Identity is the sum total of your beliefs, your values, your experiences, your memories,
Hmm.
it's like a narrative. It's a narrative
Hmm.
about yourself.
Hmm.
So in borderline, the disruption is not in the formation of the self, but much later, to age 12, 13, in the formation of an identity, this narrative about the self. Consequently, whereas the narcissist has an empty schizoid core, in other words, nothing, nothingness, there's nothing there. With a borderline, there is someone there. There is something there. But there is what we call identity diffusion, identity disturbance. In other words, the borderline has a sense of continuity, but she can wake up in the morning and have completely different values or profess to completely different beliefs, become a completely different person, change her appearance, her preferences, her prejudices, her biases, her beliefs, her values, her conduct or misconduct, her interactions, the people she likes, the people she hates, completely different person, utterly. So there is a core, at the core, the identity is in flux. Whereas the self is there, the identity is in flux. With a narcissist, there's no self, it is imported from the outside. This is the false self. So there's a false self, and the whole regulatory system, the whole regulation of sense of being, who I am, of everything comes from the outside, sense of self-worth. Everything comes from the outside. So there is this false self, which is a device to extract and elicit reactions from other people.
Hmm.
The major function of the false self is to present the kind of facade, the kind of interface that would trigger people to provide responses known collectively as narcissistic supply. The responses don't have to be positive. It's a common mistake, common myth. They could be negative. For example, the narcissist would bask in love, adulation, admiration, but a narcissist would also feel fantastically grandiose and so on if he is feared, you know. I'm the don of the mob, and you don't screw with me, and if you do, So this is narcissistic supply. And a narcissist doesn't have to be the best, the greatest, the most. It's another common misconception.
Hmm.
A narcissist has to be unique. So a narcissist can brag about being a complete failure, the greatest failure that has ever been,
Hmm.
the most amazing victim, constantly victimized by everyone all the time.
Hmm.
Or, so even negative things that other people would hide somehow, become sources of narcissistic supply because they render the narcissist unique.
Hmm.
You could even find a narcissist who says, no woman had ever agreed to sleep with me. That renders him unique, of course.
Hmm.
So that is a source of narcissistic supply. Would go around bragging about it. You have this in the incel communities online.
Right.
They compete as to who is more repulsive to women. There's a competitive victimhood, No, I'm more repulsive. No, I'm more repulsive. Here's a story to prove that I'm more repulsive. So this is all narcissistic.
Hmm.
And so the compensatory mechanism in narcissism has to do with this absence or lack of self. In the early literature, and to this very day among less informed scholars, there's a belief that the compensation in narcissism is to a sense of inferiority. Like the narcissist internally feels shame, feels inferior, and he compensates for this by projecting a facade of impunity, grandiosity, godlike qualities, and perfection. So the compensation here is counterfactual, is a falsifying compensation. Internally, the narcissist feels inferior, inadequate, a bad object, as we call it, unworthy, and then he just pretends to not be. He pretends to be the opposite of all this. So this was the perception of the compensatory aspect of narcissism early on.
Hmm.
Today, we don't think this way, well, at least those of us who are informed. We don't think this way. Today, what we think the compensation is all about is a desperate attempt to project a false self, that does not exist. Like the narcissist wants you to tell him that he exists. Of course, he wants to exist in a highly specific way. Unique, grandiose, fantastic, godlike, etc. But the whole thing is focused on convincing himself that he exists, that he is alive.
Hmm.
It's an existential disorder. And so, whereas the borderline is a much simpler disorder, that's not Samvaknin, that is Otto Kernberg, father of the field. Kernberg suggested that narcissism is a highly complex defense against borderline personality disorder. And there was another psychoanalyst, Grotstein, and Grotstein said that as the child develops, a child with borderline is terrified of her borderline condition, her borderline personality organization. So what the child does, the child develops narcissistic defenses against the borderline state. But Grotstein added, when the child fails, it remains stuck in the borderline phase. So he said, borderlines are failed narcissists. These are
Wow.
children who attempted to become narcissists as a defense against the underlying borderline condition. They have failed, so they remain borderlines. When they succeed, they become narcissists. So in every narcissist, there's a borderline kernel, a borderline core, but the reverse is not true. It's not true that every borderline is a narcissist. It is true that every narcissist has a borderline aspect or is a borderline. So this is the picture. Borderline is much less sick than the narcissist. The
Wow.
narcissism is a real severe problem. I'm hesitant to say mental illness, but it's really a problem. There's a dysfunction there. And this attempt to convince everyone, hey, listen, I exist. Tell me that I exist. Convince me that I exist. You know, this attempt is pitiable, in effect, but on the other hand, is could be very antisocial. Because there's another variant of narcissist that is the prosocial narcissist. Prosocial narcissist is someone who brags about being morally superior, moral high ground, about being a do-gooder, about being altruistic and magnanimous and charitable, the likes of which have never been seen before, ostentatiously so. So that's also a form of narcissism. But the
Mm.
majority of narcissists end up being antisocial. And they end up being antisocial because they have to coerce people. They must somehow force people to tell them what they want to hear. And if you don't, they become punitive. So there's a lot of kind of friction and unpleasantness and, worse and worse, abusive behavior.
Sam, do you view those disorders on a spectrum? In other words, is it a switch or is it a dial? Is everybody a little bit narcissist and some people are more narcissistic? Or do you think it's more just you're either a narcissist or you're not a narcissist?
So there was a guy, a psychologist by the name of Len Sperry, and in the 70s and 80s, Sperry dealt with exactly this question. Is it a spectrum or is it like pregnancy? Either you are or you're not. And he came up with a kind of a compromise, a mid-ground solution. And he said, there is disorder and there is style. And he said there's, for example, narcissistic personality disorder, and there is narcissistic style.
Hmm.
Now, narcissistic style, these are people who are obnoxious, dysympathetic to some extent, exploitative, envious, not someone you would like to go grab a beer with or befriend or associate with, let alone get married to. So these are people with narcissistic style, but they don't have the pathology. So, for example, they have a fully functional self. They can tell the difference between reality and fantasy. Narcissistic personality disorder is fantasy-based. The fantasy about the self-concept. The fantasy about the self-concept falsifies reality. So there is a problem with reality testing. The real narcissist, the person with narcissistic personality disorder, cannot tell the difference between reality and fantasy because he is cathected. He is emotionally invested in the fantasy as the only locus, the only space within which his or her inflated, grandiose, fantastic self-concept can survive. So it is only within the fantasy that the narcissist can tell himself, I'm a genius. If he were to exit the fantasy and confront reality, he would have learned very fast that he is not a genius, and that it would have been unbearable and would have led to what we call narcissistic mortification. It would have removed the narcissistic defenses, and what would have been left was the borderline core. Then this kind of narcissist becomes suicidal, the suicidal ideation, and emotionally dysregulated, indistinguishable clinically from a borderline, simply because you remove the defenses. And the only way to remove the defenses is to confront reality. So narcissists avoid reality, exactly like vampires avoid garlic, is it, or whatever.
Mhm.
So, but with narcissistic style, they're perfectly grounded in reality. They don't have a fantasy defense. They have a functional self. They're not narcissists. They're narcissistic. And so when Theodore Millon, who is one of the towering geniuses of 20th century psychology, when Theodore Millon adopted this classification, it became mainstream. And today we say that there is narcissistic style and narcissistic personality disorder. They're distinct. It's not that the style can lead to the disorder, or it's not that if you exaggerate the style, it becomes the disorder.
Mm.
Nothing to do with each other. But to a layman from the outside, they resemble each other, like both of them are obnoxious. So people say, oh, narcissist. And so the ICD, for example, when it deals with personality disorders, the ICD does say that there is a spectrum of severity, like how severe the disorder is. So whereas the DSM doesn't, the DSM adopts the view that I've just espoused, that there is a style and there is a disorder. The ICD disagrees with that. The ICD thinks that yes, you could have a disorder with various settings of severity.
Mm.
I've been in this racket for 30 years and I've dealt with thousands of narcissists. I have a database of narcissists. And I've dealt, of course, with I don't know how many family members and so on and so forth. I think Sperry was right. And I think to a large extent, the ICD is wrong on this. I think you definitely have people with a disorder, and clearly they have extreme deficiencies and defects in self-concept, in the very existence of a self, in ability to tell reality from fantasy, in reality testing. You know, they are no longer with us. They are delusional. They are it's and you can't confuse them. You can't conflate them with someone with a narcissistic personality style because the person with a personality style is with us fully functional, fully. So I think Sperry was right. If Sperry and Millen were right, and the ICD I think is getting it wrong. My view.
Just to stick with our two examples of Trump and Musk, they obviously